Clara Whitcomb pressed her fingertips against the painting and felt the lie beneath it. The false layer of paint was thin, barely a whisper of black over what had been there before. But Clara had spent 3 years learning to read what men tried to hide. Her hands did not shake. They never shook anymore. Shaking was a luxury she'd buried alongside her father. If you're watching this story unfold, subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The summer of 1816 sat heavy over Virginia, like a wool blanket soaked in river water. The heat did not relent at night. It simply changed its texture, thicker, slower, more suffocating. And by midnight, the gallery inside Blackwood Hall felt less like a room and more like a held breath. Clara had been working for 3 weeks. She had arrived at the estate with a single leather satchel, 2 changes of clothing, a set of restoration tools wrapped in oilcloth, and a name that wasn't entirely hers. The letter of introduction she'd carried identified her as C.W. Mercer Document and Portrait Restorer, formerly of Boston, currently of Richmond, available for discreet commissions, requiring careful hands and a careful mouth. C.W. Mercer was real enough. The work was real. The hands were hers. But no respectable Virginia planter in 1816 hired a woman to touch his family's valuables. Clara had learned that early. She had learned a great many things early, most of them, the kind of lessons that strip a person down to bone and leave them standing in the cold, wondering which parts of themselves are worth keeping. She kept the hands. She kept the eye. She kept the stubbornness which her mother had always called a flaw, and which Clara had quietly decided was the only reason she was still alive. The portrait hung on the east wall of the gallery, away from the windows, protected from direct light, the way valuable things sometimes were, and people rarely got to be. It was large, 6 feet tall at least, and it showed Nathaniel Blackwood's parents, as they had been painted sometime around 1790. His father stood with the practiced stillness of a man accustomed to being admired. His mother sat slightly forward, one hand resting on the arm of her chair, her expression suggesting she had something she wanted to say, but had long since decided no one in that room was worth saying it to. The fire damage had come from the left side. Smoke and heat had darkened the canvas in sweeping arcs, blurring the background, softening the edges of the figures. But the damage that interested Clara wasn't the fire damage. It was what someone had done before the fire. She had noticed it on the second day. A section of the canvas near the mother's left side near her hand, near the lower edge of her dress, had been repainted. Not restored. Repainted deliberately, with different pigment, applied by someone who knew enough to be convincing, but not enough to be invisible to a trained eye. The brushstrokes ran against the grain of the original work. The aging pattern was wrong by at least a decade. Someone had painted over something. Clara had said nothing. She was hired for restoration, not investigation, and she understood the difference between what she was paid to see and what she was paid to pretend she hadn't. But her hands kept going back to that section. And every night when the house settled into its uneasy quiet, and the servants retired and the candles burned low in their sconces, she worked. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. The patient, methodical process of removing what didn't belong, of coaxing the original truth back to the surface. Her father had taught her. Before everything fell apart, before Silas Harrow's investment company had taken the Whitcomb name and ground it into the Richmond mud, her father had spent Sunday afternoons showing her how to read old documents, how to identify forged ink, how to tell the difference between a paper that had aged honestly and one that had been made to look old by someone with something to hide. Liars always leave traces, Clara, he used to say. They can't help it. The truth wants to exist. It pushes up through everything they pile on top of it. She had been 17 when he said that. She had been 21 when the accusations came: fraud, speculation, conspiracy, and she had watched her father stand before men he had called friends and see nothing in their faces but the calculation of social distance. How far from him did they need to stand to avoid the contamination? How quickly could they move? Quickly, as it turned out. Men of means moved very quickly when their own comfort was at stake. Her father was dead by the following spring. Not hanged, not imprisoned, just done. The kind of death that comes when a man of dignity is stripped of everything that dignity was built on and discovers too late that he built it on the wrong foundation. Clara had been carrying his name like a weight and a weapon ever since. She was pressing a soft cloth dampened with solvent against the repainted section, working in small circles, when she heard the door. She didn't startle. She'd learned not to startle. Nathaniel Blackwood filled the doorway, the way tall men filled doorways when they weren't thinking about the space they took up completely unconsciously, with the kind of physical authority that came from a lifetime of rooms rearranging themselves around him. He was still dressed from whatever late business had kept him. His coat was dark, his expression darker. He held a candle that threw shadows across the hard lines of his face. "You're working past midnight again," he said. It wasn't a question. "The solvent works better in cooler air." Clara did not look away from the canvas. Less risk of the pigment lifting unevenly. He stepped into the gallery. She heard his boots on the floor, slow and deliberate, and then he was standing behind her close enough that she could feel the heat of the candle near her shoulder. "What are you doing to that section?" "Cleaning it." "That's not what cleaning looks like." She set down the cloth. She turned to face him. This was, she had decided early on, the most important thing: never to make herself smaller than she was in the presence of men who expected smallness. It didn't always protect her, but it kept something intact that she needed to keep intact. "Someone repainted a portion of this canvas," she said. "Roughly 20 to 25 years ago, based on the pigment aging. They covered something original. I'm removing the overlay to restore what was beneath it." Nathaniel's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. A tightening, a calculation, and Clara filed that away. "That falls outside your commission," he said. "Restoring a painting to its original state is exactly my commission. The painting's original state was damaged in a fire. The painting's original state predates the fire and predates the repainting. If you hired me to restore this work, then my obligation is to the original, not to the overlay." She held his gaze. "Unless you're telling me you knew about the repainting and you want it preserved." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it, the kind you could press your hand against and feel push back. "Keep going," Nathaniel said finally. His voice was low, something in it that Clara couldn't quite name. Not fear exactly. More like a man walking toward a cliff edge because he'd already decided that whatever was at the bottom was less dangerous than standing still. "But tell me immediately when you find it." He left without explaining what he expected her to find. Clara turned back to the painting. She worked until her shoulders ached, and the candle burned to a stub, and the first pale suggestion of gray touched the eastern sky beyond the gallery windows. And then, just as she was preparing to stop for the night, the solvent caught the edge of something she hadn't expected. A hand. Small. A child's hand. Positioned at the lower left of the canvas near the mother's skirt, in the exact place that had been painted over. Clara leaned in close. She worked the cloth in careful, infinitesimal strokes, removing the false paint one thin layer at a time. The hand became a wrist. The wrist became an arm. The arm became a shoulder, and then a face. A boy. Perhaps 6 or 7 years old. Standing beside Nathaniel's mother with the easy familiarity of someone who belonged there. Not a servant's child, not a distant relation, but someone painted in the same intimate register as the family's own. His clothing was fine, his posture was unself-conscious, and in his right hand, partially obscured but unmistakable. Now that the paint was coming away, he held a silver rattle engraved with a crest that Clara did not recognize. Not a Blackwood crest, another family's mark entirely. Clara sat back on her stool. Her heart was doing something complicated in her chest. Not fear, not excitement, but something between them. Something that felt like standing at the edge of a very deep well and hearing an echo come back from a direction you hadn't expected. This boy had been painted into the family portrait, and then painted out of it. And if he was legitimate, if he was the son of Nathaniel's mother by a prior or different union, then Nathaniel Blackwood might not be the rightful heir to Blackwood Hall at all. She was still sitting there, the cloth in her hand, the boy's face looking back at her from the canvas in the gray pre-dawn light, when she heard Nathaniel's voice behind her. "Tell me what you found." She hadn't heard him come in. He was 3 feet behind her, his shirt open at the collar, his eyes fixed on the painting. Whatever composure he'd carried earlier was gone. What replaced it was rawer, less controlled, more honest, and somehow more frightening because of it. Clara stood. She turned to face him. She looked at this man who commanded land and laborers and political respect across half of Virginia, and she said very quietly, "There was a child." He didn't move. "A boy," she continued. "Painted into the original canvas beside your mother. Painted over sometime after the original was completed. He's holding a silver rattle with a crest I don't recognize." She paused. "Do you know who he was?" Nathaniel walked past her to the painting. He stood in front of it for a long moment, saying nothing. His hands clasped behind his back, his breathing slow and controlled, in the way that people breathed when they were working very hard to stay in control of something that wanted to break loose. "I had a brother," he said finally. "Older, by 4 years. He died before I was born, that's what I was told. A fever. Before I was old enough to ask questions, his name stopped being spoken in this house." "And you believed that?" He turned to look at her. There was something in his expression that she hadn't seen there before. Not the guarded authority he wore like a second coat, but something more stripped down and uncertain. The face of a man who had just discovered that the floor he'd been standing on for 34 years was thinner than he'd thought. "I didn't have reason not to," he said. "You do now." He looked back at the boy in the painting, the boy who had been erased. The boy whose existence, if it could be proven legitimate, rewrote everything Nathaniel thought he knew about who he was and what he owned. "Why is his crest different?" Clara asked. "I don't know. Your mother was previously married." "Not that I was told." "Then someone lied to you." The word sat between them like a stone dropped in still water. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. Clara watched him absorb it, the particular quality of that kind of pain when the lie isn't from an enemy, but from the people who are supposed to love you most. She knew that pain. She had lived in it for 3 years. "There's something else," she said. She moved to the work table, to the small leather folio she kept her reference notes in. She pulled out the single sheet she'd set aside 2 days ago, the sheet she hadn't known what to do with yet, because she hadn't yet understood how it connected. "When I arrived, I asked Mrs. Reed for access to the estate's household records from before the fire. She brought me several boxes from the storage cellar. She thought I needed them to date the painting's original completion. I found what I needed, but I also found something else." She held the sheet out to him. "This is a receipt from a bank in Washington City, from 1809, signed by a man named Silas Harrow." Nathaniel took the paper. He read it. His expression didn't change, but something in his posture did. "Harrow," he said. "He's coming to your summer gathering," Clara said. "He arrived this morning. I saw him from the gallery window." Nathaniel looked up from the paper. "How do you know his name?" Clara met his gaze without flinching. This was the part she hadn't decided how to tell him. She'd been carrying it since the day she arrived, since the moment she'd seen Harrow's name in the household records, and felt the blood drain from her face, and the old grief come back up through her chest, like something she'd thought she'd swallowed down for good. "Because his investment company," she said carefully, "is the company that destroyed my father." The gallery was very quiet. Outside, somewhere beyond the estate's grounds, a bird called once and went silent. Nathaniel set the receipt down on the work table. He looked at the painting, at the boy who had been painted out of history, at the mother who had kept his secret, at the crest in the child's hand that didn't belong to any Blackwood. "Miss Whitcomb," he said, "I think we need to talk about what you're actually doing in my house." "I'm restoring a painting," Clara said, "and I'm beginning to think that's exactly what I was always supposed to be doing here." He looked at her for a long moment. The candle between them had burned so low it was nearly gone, the flame trembling with each breath of air that moved through the gallery. In its light, with the boy's restored face watching from the canvas behind her, Clara Whitcomb met the gaze of Nathaniel Blackwood and did not look away. "Then we may have a very large problem," Nathaniel said. "We may," Clara agreed. "But I reckon it was always going to come to this. Some lies are too big to stay buried. She looked at the painting, at the boy, at the truth that someone had spent 25 years trying to cover up. And the ones that get painted over are always the ones that push the hardest to come back. Nathaniel said nothing, but he did not leave the gallery. And Clara, for the first time in 3 years, did not feel alone with what she knew. Nathaniel did not sleep that night. Clara knew because she didn't sleep either, and sometime around 4 in the morning, she heard his boots on the floor above the gallery, back and forth, the slow, measured pacing of a man trying to think his way through something that thinking alone couldn't fix. She sat at the work table with the receipt in her hand, and the boy's face watching her from the canvas, and let herself feel for just a moment the full weight of what the night had uncovered. Then she folded the feeling up and put it somewhere she could reach it later when there was time, and went back to work. That was the thing about surviving. You didn't get to stop and grieve every revelation. You just kept moving. By the time gray morning light came through the gallery and the household began to stir, Clara had cataloged everything she'd found. The repainted section, the boy, the crest, the receipt. She had written it all down in her small leather notebook in the cramped shorthand her father had taught her. A private notation that no one else could read quickly, a habit born from years of working in houses where curious eyes were always passing through. She was cleaning her tools when Mrs. Abigail Reed appeared in the gallery doorway. Mrs. Reed was 58 years old and built like someone who had made a lifelong study of being underestimated. She had run Blackwood Hall's household for 22 years, through Nathaniel's father's decline, through the fire, through the years of grief and tension that followed, and she wore that history in the set of her shoulders and the particular quality of her silences. She didn't speak carelessly. When she said something, it mattered. "You found something," Mrs. Reed said. It wasn't a question. "I restored a section of the original canvas." Clara kept her voice neutral. There was an earlier figure painted over. Mrs. Reed walked into the gallery. She stood in front of the portrait for a long moment. Clara watched her face, watched the recognition move across it, not surprise, not shock, but something older and more complicated. The look of someone who had known a truth for a very long time and had simply been waiting for the right person to find it. "You knew," Clara said quietly. "I was 17 when that painting was completed," Mrs. Reed said. "I was a housemaid then. I carried trays and kept my eyes down and did what I was told." She paused. "I know what was in that painting before Mr. Blackwood's father had it changed." "The boy. James?" Mrs. Reed said the name like she was setting something fragile down on a table. "His name was James. He was Eliza Blackwood's son from her first marriage. She was a widow when she married into this family. James was 4 years old. He was a sweet child. Quiet. He liked the horses." Clara waited. "He didn't die of a fever," Mrs. Reed said. "He was sent away. I don't know where. I was told by the housekeeper at the time that I had never seen a child named James in this house, and that if I valued my position, I would continue to not have seen him." She turned to look at Clara. "I valued my position. I had a mother to support and no other prospects. So I kept what I knew, and I kept quiet about it, and I have lived with that for 40 years. The silence between them was the kind that deserved respect. "Why are you telling me now?" Clara asked. "Because you found him." Mrs. Reed looked at the boy in the painting, at the small face that had been hidden under black paint for 2 decades. "Because someone finally did." Clara thought about that. She thought about the receipt with Harrow's name. She thought about her father, about the accusations that had come out of nowhere, about the investment scheme that had taken everything and left behind only the ruin of a man who had never done anything wrong. "Mrs. Reed," she said, "do you know the name Silas Harrow?" Something shifted in the older woman's expression. Not fear, something past fear. The look of a person who has already survived the worst and recognizes the name of the thing that caused it. "He came to this house once," Mrs. Reed said. 7 years ago. He met with Mr. Blackwood's father in the study, and they were in there for 4 hours, and when Harrow left, the old man looked like something had reached inside him and taken hold of something essential." She paused. "He was never quite right after that. He died the following winter." What did they talk about? I was never told. But the following month, the old Mr. Blackwood made significant changes to his will. And the month after that, a man I didn't recognize spent 3 days in the estate office going through the old family records. Clara set her cleaning cloth down very carefully. Which records? The ones from Eliza Blackwood's first marriage. The thing that was happening in Clara's chest right now was not panic. She was very clear about that. It was something more precise than panic, a specific focused kind of alarm that had a shape to it that could be examined and worked with. Her father had called it useful fear, the kind that sharpens you instead of stopping you. I need to see those records, Clara said. They may not still be there. Then I need to know what's missing. Mrs. Reed looked at her for a long moment, weighing something, measuring something running, some internal calculation that Clara couldn't see the details of, but could feel the weight of. I'll unlock the estate office this afternoon, Mrs. Reed said finally, when the guests are occupied. She left without another word. Clara turned back to the painting. James looked back at her. I'm going to find out what happened to you, she told him. She wasn't entirely sure why she said it out loud. Some habits from childhood died hard, and her father had always said that promises meant more when you spoke them into the air. Nathaniel found her an hour later. He had clearly not slept, and he had clearly not spent the sleepless hours doing anything peaceful. He came into the gallery with the particular energy of a man who had made a decision and was still deciding whether it was the right one, and he stood across the work table from Clara and looked at the painting for a moment before he spoke. My mother had a first husband, he said. I found it in a letter, in my father's papers from the back of a drawer I'd never opened. His name was George Alderton. He died in 1783. They had a son. He stopped. A son named James. I know, Clara said. Mrs. Reed told me. Something moved across his face. Not anger, something more complicated. The particular expression of a man discovering that the people around him have been carrying truths he was never given access to. She knew. She was 17 and needed her position. Don't be hard on her. His jaw worked. He looked at the painting. At the boy who had been his brother, painted out of existence by a father who apparently had reasons Clara didn't yet fully understand. Why would my father paint him out? Nathaniel said. If James was legitimate, if he was Eliza's son by a prior marriage, that's not shameful. Widows remarried. It was common. Unless James was more than Eliza's son by a prior marriage, Clara said carefully. Nathaniel went still. Unless George Alderton's estate, James's inheritance by right, was something your father's family wanted, and unless the only way to access it cleanly was to make James disappear from the record. She watched him process this. I found a receipt in the household records. Harrow's Bank handled a significant land transfer in 1809. Land that, if I'm right about the Alderton crest on that rattle, may have originally belonged to James. The silence that followed was absolute. Harrow, Nathaniel said. He's connected to this. I don't know how far back the connection goes yet, but your father met with him 7 years ago, and after that meeting your father changed his will and had someone go through the old family records. And within 2 years, your father was dead. Nathaniel moved to the work table. He placed both hands flat on its surface and looked down, breathing slowly with the controlled deliberateness of a man deciding which part of an enormous weight to pick up first. You think Harrow knew about James, he said. I think Harrow may have created the situation around James, or exploited it, or both. Clara paused. And I think whatever he held over your father, he's been holding over this family's finances ever since. And my father's will changes. May have been made under pressure, yes. Nathaniel looked up at her. His eyes were very dark and very direct, the eyes of a man who had spent a lifetime being in command of situations, and was now standing in one he couldn't command his way out of. You came here to restore a painting, he said. I did. And now you're telling me that a man who destroyed your father may also have had a hand in destroying mine. I'm telling you what the evidence suggests, Clara said. I'm not telling you what to do with it. What would you do? She met his gaze. I'd find the proof. All of it. Before Harrow has any reason to think we're looking. Nathaniel straightened. He reached into his coat and placed something on the work table beside the receipt. A key. Old iron with a length of faded blue ribbon tied through its bow. "Estate office," he said. "My father's private cabinet. Mrs. Reed has the second key. Whatever's in there, I want to know." He left. Clara picked up the key. It was heavier than it looked. She thought about her father, about the afternoon he had sat across from her at the kitchen table in the Boston house and told her very quietly that men had come to him with documents. Investment documents. Partnership agreements. He had signed them because the men were well-dressed and well-spoken, and because he had believed foolishly that respectability was a kind of protection. It wasn't. She knew that now. Respectability was just another thing that could be taken from you. But proof was different. Proof was harder to bury. The summer gathering at Blackwood Hall began that afternoon with the particular social performance that Virginia landowners of means had perfected over generations. A choreography of ease and wealth of conversations conducted beneath the shade of old trees of whiskey served in good glasses of laughter that said, "We belong here," more clearly than any spoken declaration could. Clara moved through it invisibly, which was one of the genuine advantages of being a woman in a working capacity. No one looked at her directly. No one spoke to her unless they needed something moved or cleaned or identified. She was to the assembled judges and planters and political men of Nathaniel Blackwood's social circle approximately as noteworthy as a well-made piece of furniture. She used that invisibility the way she used her solvents, carefully with precision to remove what was covering what she needed to see. She listened. Silas Harrow was exactly what she had expected him to be, which was somehow worse than if he'd been surprising. He was 52 years old, lean and polished, with the manner of a man who had been charming for so long that charm had become involuntary, a reflex like breathing. He shook hands and laughed at the right moments, and asked intelligent questions about crop yields and trade routes, and if you didn't know what he was impressive. Even knowing what he was, Clara could see how men trusted him. Her father had trusted him. That was the part that never entirely stopped hurting. She was crossing the hall with a box of restoration materials when Harrow appeared at the end of the corridor. He saw her immediately. She could tell from the way his expression didn't change too deliberately, too completely, that he had already been told who she was. "Miss Mercer," he said pleasantly, "I understand you're doing remarkable work with the family portrait." Clara stopped walking. She looked at him. She kept her face precisely as neutral as his. "The work is progressing," she said. "I'm sure it is." He took 3 steps toward her, close enough to be conversational, far enough to be deniable. "I knew your father, you know, Charles Whitcomb. A good man. A very unfortunate situation." The word unfortunate landed like a hand around her throat. "Yes," she said carefully. "It was." These things happen sadly in the world of investment. He tilted his head slightly. Particularly when men overextend themselves, sign documents they don't fully understand. A pause, almost sympathetic, almost regretful. "I do hope you've been able to find stability since then. A woman alone with your family's history, it can't be easy." "I manage," Clara said. "I'm sure you do." He smiled. It was a very good smile. "Though I do wonder what a woman in your position working under a man's name in a house like this one might imagine she could gain by stirring up old stories." He let that sit for exactly 1 beat. "Restoration work is delicate, Miss Mercer. The wrong solvent can destroy more than it reveals. I'd hate to see you make a mistake that cost you the little you have left." He walked past her down the corridor. Clara stood very still until the sound of his footsteps faded. Then she set the box down on a side table, pressed both hands flat against its surface, and breathed. He knew. Or he suspected. Either way, he had just told her 2 things without meaning to, that he was watching her, and that he was afraid of what she might find. Men who weren't afraid didn't issue warnings. Men who weren't afraid let you work in peace. She picked up the box and kept walking. That evening, while Harrow held court among the guests in the parlor, Clara and Mrs. Reed went to the estate office. The private cabinet was in the back corner behind a writing desk that smelled of tobacco and old paper. Clara unlocked it with Nathaniel's key. Inside, she found 3 ledger books, a bundle of letters tied with cord, and a sealed envelope addressed in handwriting she didn't recognize to a solicitor in Washington City. She and Mrs. Reed worked by lamplight carefully in silence. The first ledger was household accounts. Nothing. The second ledger was investment records. And here Clara's hands slowed, because the numbers in the second ledger did not add up. Not in the way of a man who had made bad decisions, in the way of a man who had been systematically bled. Small payments repeated over years to accounts with no names attached. The kind of payments that had the particular rhythm of blackmail, not a single demand, but a slow, patient extraction that took just enough to hurt without ever taking quite enough to break. "Someone was paying Harrow," Clara said quietly. Mrs. Reed leaned over her shoulder. "For years by the look of it. Since 1809. Clara traced the date column with her finger. "Since Harrow came to the house." "Since he found out about James," Mrs. Reed said. Clara opened the bundle of letters. Most were business correspondence, dry and formal. But near the bottom of the bundle, she found 3 letters in a different hand. A woman's hand, careful and precise. The letters were addressed to Eliza Blackwood. They were from a solicitor named Hugh Granger in Philadelphia. The first letter confirmed the existence of James Alderton, legitimate son of George Alderton, with full inheritance rights to the Alderton land holdings in Western Virginia. The second letter noted that James had been placed in the care of a family in Pennsylvania by arrangement of the Blackwood family, and that Mr. Granger was concerned about the legality of the arrangement given James's inheritance rights. The third letter was different. It was short. It said, "Only Mrs. Blackwood. I must advise you that the documents you have signed regarding James's rights may have been obtained under false pretense. I believe you were misled about their nature and intent. I am preparing a challenge. Please do not sign anything further until we have spoken. This letter is dated 1791. There was no fourth letter from Mr. Granger. Clara sat very still, looking at the 3 pieces of paper in her hands. "He stopped her," she said. "Somehow. He stopped the solicitor, he stopped Eliza from fighting it, and then he spent the next 20 years making sure the evidence was buried." She looked up at Mrs. Reed. "And when Harrow found out when he came to the house in 1809 and put it all together, he didn't expose it. He monetized it. He's been blackmailing this family," Mrs. Reed said. The words came out flat and certain, the way words came out when someone had suspected something for a long time and was finally hearing it confirmed. "And when the old Mr. Blackwood died, and Nathaniel inherited," Clara continued, "Harrow would have needed to establish the same hold over the new heir. Except he couldn't, because Nathaniel didn't know any of this." She paused. "So Harrow has been waiting, collecting, preparing, and now he's here for the summer gathering surrounded by judges and landowners with every piece of leverage he needs." The lamp between them flickered. "He's going to move against Nathaniel here," Mrs. Reed said, "in front of everyone." "Yes," Clara said, "he is." She folded the letters carefully and placed them inside her notebook. She returned the ledgers to the cabinet exactly as she'd found them. She locked it. She stood up and looked at Mrs. Reed with the particular kind of clarity that came to her in moments of precise and focused danger. "We need to tell Nathaniel tonight," she said, "before Harrow makes his move." But Nathaniel found them first. He was in the corridor outside the estate office when they emerged, and from the look on his face, the tight, controlled fury of a man who had just learned something in the parlor that he hadn't known 5 minutes ago, Clara understood that Harrow had already begun. "He just made an announcement," Nathaniel said. His voice was very quiet. "In front of every judge and landowner in that parlor. He told them he has documents proving my father's succession was fraudulent, that there's a legitimate prior heir." He looked at Clara. "He's calling a formal hearing for tomorrow morning." Clara did not hesitate. "Good," she said. Nathaniel stared at her. "Good. Yes?" She held up the notebook. "Because we have more than he does. And tomorrow morning he's going to find that out in front of every man in that parlor." Nathaniel looked at the notebook, looked at her face, looked at Mrs. Reed, who gave him the small, firm nod of a woman who had been waiting 40 years for this particular morning to arrive. Then he looked back at Clara. "How long will you need?" he asked. 2 hours, she said, "and access to your father's correspondence with the Philadelphia solicitor." "I'll get it." He turned to go, then he stopped. Without turning back, in a voice stripped of everything except the truth underneath it, he said, "Miss Whitcomb, I owe you an apology." Clara waited. "When you arrived," he said, "I thought you were a desperate woman with clever hands taking a commission she needed, and no more." A pause. "I was wrong about what you were doing here. I was wrong about what you were capable of." Another pause longer. "I was wrong about a great many things, and I reckon this isn't the time to list them all." "No," Clara agreed. "It isn't. But I wanted you to know." He left. Mrs. Reed watched him go with an expression that was for the first time since Clara had met her something close to satisfied. "He's his mother's son," Mrs. Reed said quietly. She would have apologized too. Clara looked down at the notebook in her hands, at the letters inside it, at the boy in the painting still watching from the gallery wall with his silver rattle and his family crest and his 40 years of enforced silence. "Then let's make sure he's also his own man," she said, "starting tomorrow." She went back to the gallery. She worked through the night. And she didn't shake not once because shaking was still a luxury she couldn't afford, and because somewhere in the last 24 hours, the thing she'd been carrying alone for 3 years had acquired a second set of hands. It was not a comfortable feeling. It was not a safe feeling. But it was real. And after 3 years of surviving on her own, real was the thing she had missed most. Nathaniel did not sleep that night. Clara knew because she didn't sleep either. And sometime around 4 in the morning she heard his boots on the floorboards above the gallery, back and forth, the slow measured pacing of a man trying to think his way through something that thinking alone couldn't fix. She sat at the work table with the receipt in her hand and the boy's face watching her from the canvas and let herself feel for just a moment the full weight of what the night had uncovered. Then she folded the feeling up and put it somewhere she could reach it later when there was time and went back to work. That was the thing about surviving. You didn't get to stop and grieve every revelation. You just kept moving. By the time gray morning light came through the gallery windows and the household began to stir below, Clara had cataloged everything she'd found. The repainted section. The boy. The crest. The receipt with Harrow's name. She had written it all down in her small leather notebook, in the cramped shorthand her father had taught her, a private notation that no one else could read quickly, a habit born from years of working in houses where curious eyes were always passing through doors. She was cleaning her brushes when Mrs. Abigail Reed appeared in the gallery doorway. Mrs. Reed was 58 years old and built like someone who had made a lifelong study of being underestimated. She had run Blackwood Hall's household for 22 years, through Nathaniel's father's slow decline through the fire, through the years of grief and suffocating tension that followed, and she wore that history in the set of her shoulders and the particular quality of her silences. She didn't speak carelessly. When she said something, it landed. "You found something," Mrs. Reed said. It wasn't a question. "I restored a section of the original canvas." Clara kept her voice neutral. "There was an earlier figure painted over." Mrs. Reed walked into the gallery without being invited. She stood in front of the portrait for a long moment. Clara watched her face, watched the recognition move across it. Not surprise, not shock, but something older and far more complicated. The expression of a person who had known a truth for a very long time and had simply been waiting with diminishing hope for the right person to find it. "You knew," Clara said quietly. "I was 17 when that painting was first completed," Mrs. Reed said. "I was a housemaid then. I carried trays and kept my eyes down and did what I was told." She paused. "I know what was in that painting before the old Mr. Blackwood had it changed." "The boy." "James?" Mrs. Reed said the name the way you set down something fragile carefully, deliberately with both hands. "His name was James. He was Eliza Blackwood's son from her first marriage. She was a widow when she married into this family. James was 4 years old when she came to Blackwood Hall. He was a sweet child, quiet. He liked the horses. Clara waited. He didn't die of a fever, Mrs. Reed said. He was sent away. I don't know where. I was told by the housekeeper at the time that I had never seen a child named James in this house, and that if I valued my position, I would continue to not have seen him. She turned and looked directly at Clara. I valued my position. I had a mother to support and no other prospects. So I kept what I knew, and I kept my mouth shut, and I have lived with that choice for 40 years. The silence between them deserved respect, and Clara gave it. Why are you telling me now? She asked. Because you found him. Mrs. Reed looked at the boy in the painting, the small recovered face, the silver rattle, the crest that didn't belong to any Blackwood. Because someone finally did. Clara thought about it. She thought about the receipt. She thought about her father, about the accusations that came out of nowhere, about the investment scheme that had taken the Whitcomb name and ground it into nothing, about a man who had never done anything wrong dying quietly in a rented room because there was nothing left in him to keep going. Mrs. Reed, she said, do you know the name Silas Harrow? Something moved through the older woman's expression. Not fear exactly. Something past fear, the look of a person who has already survived the worst version of something and now recognizes the name of what caused it. He came to this house once, Mrs. Reed said. 7 years ago, he met with the old Mr. Blackwood in the study. They were in there for 4 hours. When Harrow left, the old man looked like something had reached inside him and taken hold of something essential and simply squeezed. She paused. He was never quite right after that visit. He died the following winter. What did they talk about? I was never told. But the following month, the old Mr. Blackwood made significant changes to his will. And 2 weeks after that, a man I didn't recognize spent 3 days in the estate office going through the old family records. Clara set her brush down very carefully. Which records? The ones from Eliza Blackwood's first marriage. The thing happening in Clara's chest right now was not panic. She was very clear about that. It was something more precise, a specific focused alarm that had a shape to it, that could be examined and worked with, rather than simply endured. Her father had called it useful fear, the kind that sharpened you instead of stopping you. I need to see those records, Clara said. They may not still be there. Then I need to know what's missing. Mrs. Reed studied her for a long moment, weighing something, running some internal calculation that Clara couldn't see the details of, but could feel the full weight of. I'll unlock the estate office this afternoon, Mrs. Reed said finally, when the guests arrive and Harrow is occupied. She left without another word. Clara turned back to the painting. James looked back at her from the canvas, the small face restored, the eyes clear, the hand holding the silver rattle as though no one had ever tried to take it from him. I'm going to find out what happened to you, Clara told him. She wasn't sure why she said it out loud. Some habits from childhood died hard, and her father had always said that promises meant more when you spoke them into the air. Nathaniel found her an hour later. He had clearly not slept, and he had clearly not spent those sleepless hours doing anything peaceful. He came into the gallery with the particular energy of a man who had made a decision in the dark, and was still testing its weight in the light, and he placed something on the work table without preamble. A letter. Old. The handwriting on the envelope was a woman's, careful, precise, slightly rushed at the edges, the way handwriting got when the hand behind it was frightened. It was in my father's private papers, he said. Back of a locked drawer I'd never opened. I found it at 3 this morning. He paused. My mother had a first husband, George Alderton. He died in 1783. They had a son. James, Clara said. Nathaniel went still. You already know. Mrs. Reed told me. She remembered him. The expression that crossed his face was something she hadn't seen there before. Not the careful authority he wore like a second coat, but something rawer underneath it. The face of a man discovering that the people closest to him had been carrying truths he was never given access to, and had carried them alone, and had said nothing for 40 years. She knew, he said. And there was something in his voice, not accusation, but the particular bruised quality of betrayal that came from people you trusted, not enemies. She was 17 and needed her position, Clara said firmly, but not harshly. Don't be hard on her. She's been waiting for someone to find it. His jaw worked. He looked at the painting. At James. At the small face that had been his brother, painted out of history by a father who had reasons Clara didn't yet fully understand. Why would my father paint him out? Nathaniel said. A widow's child from a prior marriage, that's not shameful. It happened. Remarriage was common. Unless James was more than a stepchild, Clara said carefully. Unless George Alderton's estate, James's legal inheritance, was land or property that someone in this family wanted, and unless the only way to access it cleanly was to make James disappear from every record that existed. Nathaniel went very still. The receipt I found, Clara continued. Harrow's bank handled a significant land transfer in 1809, land in western Virginia. I believe, based on the crest on that rattle, that the land originally belonged to the Alderton family and by rights to James. The silence that followed was so complete that Clara could hear the morning birds outside and the distant sound of horses being moved in the stable yard, and nothing else. Harrow, Nathaniel said. The word came out low and flat and final, the way a man said a word when it had just become the name for everything he was going to have to reckon with. He found out about James, and he didn't expose it. Clara held his gaze. He monetized it. Nathaniel placed both hands flat on the work table and looked down, breathing in the slow, controlled way of a man deciding which part of an enormous weight to pick up first. For how long? He said. Since 1809 at minimum, since the visit Mrs. Reed described. Clara paused. And when your father died and you inherited Harrow, lost his leverage. You didn't know any of this. There was nothing to hold over you. She watched his face. So he waited. He gathered what he needed. And now he's here at your gathering, surrounded by judges and landowners, and he's ready to move. Nathaniel looked up at her. His eyes were very dark and very direct, and in them Clara could see something shifting, not breaking, not collapsing, but reorganizing. The way a foundation reorganized when you stripped away what had been built on top of it and found out whether the ground underneath was solid. What do you need? He said. The question was so simple and so direct that it caught her off guard for just a moment. Access to your father's correspondence with anyone in Philadelphia, she said, and Mrs. Reed's key to the estate office. He reached into his coat and placed a key on the table. Old iron, a length of faded blue ribbon through the bow. I'll get the correspondence, he said. Tonight while Harrow is at dinner. He left. Clara picked up the key. It was heavier than it looked. The summer gathering at Blackwood Hall arrived that afternoon, with all the performance of wealth and ease that Virginia landowners had been perfecting for generations. Guests moved through the house and grounds. Judges, planters, merchants, political men from Washington City, with the particular confidence of people who had never had serious reason to doubt their place in the world. Laughter rose and fell. Glasses were refilled. Conversations about land and trade and the recovering post-war economy moved through the warm summer air like currency being exchanged. Clara moved through it all invisibly. This was one of the genuine advantages of her position. Working women in houses of quality were approximately as noticeable as good furniture. No one addressed her directly. No one looked at her when she crossed a room. She was C.W. Mercer, the portrait restorer, and she had a commission to complete, and she was completely beneath the notice of every important man in that house. She listened to everything. Silas Harrow was exactly what she had expected, which was somehow worse than if he'd been surprising. He was polished and warm and effortlessly charming. The kind of man who made people feel chosen simply by paying them attention. He asked intelligent questions. He laughed at the right moments. He had the particular gift of making each person he spoke to feel like the most important person in the room, and Clara could see, watching from the edges of every gathering he entered, exactly how her father had trusted him. She was carrying a box of materials through the entrance hall when Harrow stepped into her path. He had been waiting. She understood that immediately from the way he positioned himself, not casually, not accidentally, but with the precise intentionality of a man who had planned this moment and was now executing it. "Miss Mercer," he said pleasantly, "I hear the portrait restoration is going remarkably well." Clara stopped. She looked at him. She kept her face exactly as neutral as his. "The work is progressing," she said. "Wonderful." He took 2 steps toward her, close enough to be conversational, far enough to be deniable. "I knew your father, you know, Charles Whitcomb. A genuinely good man. Such an unfortunate situation." The word unfortunate hit her somewhere between her sternum and her throat. "Yes," she said. "It was. These things happen in the world of investment, sadly." He tilted his head with the practiced sympathy of a man who had performed sympathy so many times it had become indistinguishable from the real thing. Particularly when men overextend themselves, sign documents they perhaps don't fully understand in their eagerness to build something. A small regretful pause. "I do hope you've found stability since then. A woman alone with a family history like yours, it can't be an easy path." "I manage," Clara said. "I'm sure you do. You seem remarkably capable." He smiled. The smile was warm and impeccably constructed and reached nowhere near his eyes. "Though I do find myself wondering what a woman in your position, working under a man's name, in a house like this one, with access to old records and private galleries, might imagine she could gain by disturbing things that are better left undisturbed." He let that sit for exactly 1 beat. Restoration work is delicate. The wrong solvent destroys more than it reveals. I'd hate to see you make a mistake that costs you the little you have left. He walked past her down the corridor. Easy, unhurried. The walk of a man who was not accustomed to being worried about. Clara stood very still until his footsteps faded entirely. Then she set the box down on the nearest surface, pressed both hands flat against it, and breathed through the rage that moved through her in a single hot wave from her chest to her fingertips. He knew, or he suspected enough that the difference didn't matter. Either way, he had just handed her 2 pieces of information he hadn't intended to give. He was watching her, and he was afraid of what she might find. Men who weren't afraid didn't issue warnings. Men who weren't afraid let you work in peace and never gave you a second glance. She picked up the box and kept walking. That evening, while Harrow held court in the front parlor and the assembled guests drank Nathaniel's whiskey and debated tariff policy, Clara and Mrs. Reed went to the estate office. The private cabinet was iron-fronted set, flush against the back wall behind the writing desk. Clara unlocked it. Inside 3 ledger books, a bundle of letters tied with cord, a sealed envelope addressed to a Washington City solicitor in handwriting Clara didn't recognize. They worked by lamplight, carefully, without speaking unless necessary. The first ledger was household accounts going back 15 years, nothing unusual. The second ledger was investment and financial records. And here Clara's hands slowed, because the numbers did not add up in the way of a man who had made bad investments. They added up in the way of a man being systematically bled. Small payments repeated across years to accounts identified only by initials. The rhythm of the payments was distinctive, not a single large demand, but a slow, patient extraction. Just enough to hurt. Never quite enough to break. The architecture of blackmail practiced by someone who understood that a dead source of income was no income at all. Someone was paying Harrow, Clara said quietly. Mrs. Reed leaned over her shoulder. For years. Since 1809. Clara traced the first entry with her fingertip. Since the visit. Since he found out about James, Mrs. Reed said. Clara opened the bundle of letters. Most were business correspondence, dry, formal, unremarkable. But near the bottom, she found 3 letters in a different hand. A woman's hand, careful, precise, slightly trembling at the descenders, the way a hand trembled when the person holding the pen was trying very hard not to show fear. The letters were addressed to Eliza Blackwood. They were from a solicitor named Hugh Granger, Philadelphia. Clara read the first letter. It confirmed the existence of James Alderton, legitimate son of George Alderton, with full inheritance rights to the Alderton land holdings in Western Virginia. under the terms of George Alderton's will. She read the second. It stated that James had been placed in the care of a Pennsylvania family by arrangement of the Blackwood household, and that Mr. Granger was deeply concerned about the legality of this arrangement given James's standing inheritance rights, and that he was seeking clarification. She read the third. It was short. 7 lines. It said, Mrs. Blackwood, I must advise you urgently that the documents you have signed regarding James's rights and the disposition of the Alderton estate were obtained under conditions that may constitute legal fraud. I believe you were misled regarding their nature and their effect. I am preparing a formal challenge, and I believe we can recover what has been taken. Please do not sign anything further. Please do not speak of this to anyone in this household until we have spoken directly. I will come to you. The letter was dated March 1791. There was no fourth letter from Hugh Granger. Clara sat very still. He stopped him, she said. The words came out flat and certain because the conclusion was flat and certain, and there was no softer way to say it. Somehow, he stopped the solicitor. He stopped Eliza from fighting it. He buried every record he could reach. And then he spent the next 18 years making sure there was nothing left to find. She looked up at Mrs. Reed. And when Harrow pieced it together in 1809 and came to this house, he didn't expose it. He walked in through that door and handed the old Mr. Blackwood a bill for silence, and he's been collecting ever since. Mrs. Reed was quiet for a moment. Then she said, The old man signed a great many things in his last years, more than was usual, more than made sense for a man of his means and his age. Transfers, Clara said. Accounts. Land deeds. I don't know the details, but I know he was frightened. For the last 2 years of his life he was frightened in a way I hadn't seen before. And after he died... She paused. Harrow sent a letter of condolence. Nathaniel read it and thanked him for it. He didn't know what it was. What was it? A reminder, Mrs. Reed said, that Harrow knew, and that whoever held Blackwood Hall now had better understand that fact. Clara folded the 3 letters and placed them inside her notebook. She returned the ledgers exactly as she'd found them closed. The cabinet turned the key. She stood up and faced Mrs. Reed in the lamplight, and felt the particular clarity that came to her in moments of precise and focused danger. The clarity her father's teaching had given her, the clarity that 3 years of surviving alone had honed to something very sharp. He's going to move against Nathaniel at this gathering, she said, before it ends, in front of witnesses. Yes, Mrs. Reed agreed. That's why he came. Then we have one night. She was already moving toward the door when Mrs. Reed said quietly, Miss Whitcomb. Clara stopped. Your father, Mrs. Reed said. Was he a good man? Yes, Clara said. He was a very good man. Good. Then find the rest of it. Mrs. Reed's voice was steady and deliberate and carried 40 years of weight. Not just for Nathaniel. Find all of it. Clara nodded once and went. Nathaniel was waiting in the corridor outside the estate office. He had come from the parlor, she could tell, from the tension in his jaw, from the controlled fury in his posture, from the way he looked at her when she emerged as though she were the one fixed point in a room that was tilting. He made an announcement, Nathaniel said. His voice was very quiet. 20 minutes ago, in the parlor, in front of Judge Harrington and 4 other men. He stopped, breathed. He told them he has documents. Documents proving my father's succession was fraudulent, that there is a legitimate prior heir to Blackwood Hall. Another pause. He's calling for a formal proceeding. Tomorrow morning. Clara looked at him. At this man who had inherited a lie along with an estate and had spent his whole life standing on ground he didn't know was hollow underneath. Good, she said. He stared at her. Good, yes. She held up the notebook with the letters inside it. Because we have more than he does. And tomorrow morning he's going to discover that in front of every single one of those men. Nathaniel looked at the notebook. He looked at her face. He looked at Mrs. Reed, who stood in the doorway behind Clara with the quiet, immovable certainty of a woman who had been waiting 40 years for exactly this. Then he looked back at Clara, and something in his expression, the careful, guarded surface of it, shifted in a way that was visible and real, and not performed. "What do you need from me?" he said. "Your father's full correspondence file. Tonight. Every letter he kept from anyone in Philadelphia or Washington City." She held his gaze. "And I need you to trust me." The words sat between them. Then Nathaniel Blackwood, who had spent 34 years trusting almost no one, said, "All right." "And one more thing," Clara said. "Whatever Harrow says to you tonight, however he approaches you, you say nothing about what we've found. Nothing." "Understood. He thinks he's already won. Let him keep thinking that until morning." Nathaniel looked at her for a moment that was long enough to mean something. Then he said, "I reckon I owe you more than I know how to say right now." "You don't owe me anything yet," Clara said. "Ask me again tomorrow afternoon." She went back to the gallery. She worked through the night by lamplight with the letters spread across the work table and James watching from the canvas and the sound of Harrow's voice carrying faintly from the parlor below. Smooth, confident, unhurried, the voice of a man who had never once in 20 years of doing exactly this been caught. Clara listened to that voice, and she thought about her father. And she worked. And she did not shake. Not once. The morning of the formal proceeding arrived, the way bad things often did, quietly, without drama, with the particular stillness of air before a storm decides what it wants to be. Clara had not slept. She had worked through the night with Nathaniel's correspondence files spread across the work table beside Granger's 3 letters and the second ledger's payment records, cross-referencing dates, names, account notations, building the kind of evidentiary map that her father had taught her to build. The kind that didn't depend on a single document, but on the pattern that emerged when enough documents were placed side by side, and the truth underneath them became visible, the way an original painting became visible when the false layer was finally removed. By 4 in the morning, she had it. Not all of it, but enough. Enough to do what needed to be done in front of Judge Harrington and every landowner and political man assembled in that parlor. Nathaniel found her at 5. He came in without knocking, which he had started doing sometime around the second day, and which Clara had decided she didn't mind, because the only people who entered rooms without knocking were people who no longer thought of themselves as guests in the space. He stood across the work table from her and looked at what she'd laid out, and she watched his face as he read the slow, careful reading of a man who was absorbing something enormous and refusing to let it knock him sideways. "This is enough," he said finally. It wasn't a question. "It's enough to challenge his documents," Clara said. "It's enough to demand a full legal investigation. It's enough to make every man in that parlor understand that what Harrow is presenting as settled fact is built on 30 years of forgery and blackmail." She paused. "It's enough to make him afraid." "Will it be enough to stop him today?" Clara looked at him directly. "That depends on Harrow, and on Judge Harrington." "Harrington is an honest man," Nathaniel said. "I've known him 15 years. If the evidence is sound, he'll see it. Then it'll be enough." Nathaniel looked at the painting. At James, fully restored, now standing beside his mother, with the silver rattle and the Alderton crest, clear and undeniable in the morning light. He looked at his brother, the brother he'd never known he had, for a long moment. And Clara let him have it, without interrupting, because some things deserved a moment before the battle started. "He was sent to Pennsylvania," Nathaniel said quietly. "If he lived, one thing at a time," Clara said, not unkindly. "First we take away Harrow's weapon. Then we look for James." Nathaniel nodded. He straightened. He became, in the space of one breath, the man that Virginia knew, composed certain carrying authority in his posture, the way he'd been carrying it since birth. But underneath it, Clara could see what was new, something that hadn't been there a week ago, something harder and more honest than authority. Resolve. The real kind. The kind that came from knowing exactly what you were fighting for. "I'll be ready," he said. "So will I," Clara said. He left. Clara turned back to the work table and spent the next 2 hours doing what she did best, organizing truth into a form that could not be dismissed. The parlor at 10 o'clock was standing room only. Judge Harrington sat at the head of the long table, 60 years old, and carrying those years with the particular dignity of a man who had presided over enough human wreckage to have stopped being surprised by it. 4 other men of legal and political standing sat flanking him. The remaining guests lined the walls, planters' merchants. 2 men Clara recognized from Richmond's banking community, a newspaper correspondent from Washington City, who had arrived the previous day, and whose presence Harrow had clearly arranged in advance. A newspaper correspondent. Clara had noticed him immediately. Harrow wasn't just planning to win today. He was planning to make sure the entire eastern seaboard heard about it. Nathaniel stood at one end of the table. His posture was straight, his face controlled, but Clara could see the tension in his hands. Fingers slightly spread the way hands went when a person was consciously keeping them still. Clara stood to his left and slightly behind him. Mrs. Reed stood near the door. Harrow entered last. He had dressed for this. There was no other way to describe it. The coat, the cravat, the ease with which he moved to his position at the table, the way he acknowledged the assembled men with small nods that managed to convey both humility and absolute confidence simultaneously. He set a leather portfolio on the table in front of him. He looked at Clara once. Just once. The look lasted less than a second, but it carried everything. The warning from the corridor, the threat wrapped in pleasantry, the certainty that she was a nuisance he had already calculated the cost of removing. She looked back at him and gave him nothing. "Gentlemen," Harrow began, "I appreciate your time and your patience. I want to be clear from the outset that I take no pleasure in what I am about to present. Nathaniel Blackwood is a man I respect. His father was a man I respected. What I bring before you today is not an attack on this family, but a matter of legal and moral obligation that, once known, cannot in conscience be left unaddressed." He opened the portfolio. Clara felt Nathaniel shift his weight beside her almost imperceptibly. "In 1785, Harrow continued, Eliza Alderton, then recently widowed mother to a 4-year-old son named James, married into the Blackwood family. This is not disputed. What has been suppressed for 30 years is what followed." He withdrew a document and placed it on the table. "This is a sworn statement from a notary in Philadelphia attesting to the existence of George Alderton's will, executed in 1782, naming his son James as sole heir to the Alderton estate, including land holdings of approximately 800 acres in western Virginia." Silence in the room. 800 acres, Harrow said, letting the number sit. "Land that is currently held under Blackwood title. Land that James Alderton, if living, or his rightful descendants, can claim by legal right." He placed a second document beside the first. "I have here a transfer record signed by Eliza Blackwood in 1791, appearing to relinquish James's inheritance rights. However, gentlemen," he paused, looked around the table with the expression of a man genuinely pained by what he was about to say, "I have also obtained testimony from 2 witnesses who were present at the signing of this document, who attest that Eliza Blackwood did not understand what she was signing, that she was told it was a routine household matter, that she was in the plainest terms deceived." Judge Harrington looked at the documents, then he looked at Nathaniel. "Mr. Blackwood, what do you say to this?" Nathaniel said, "I say that Mr. Harrow has told you half a story, Your Honor, and I'd like Miss Whitcomb to tell you the rest." The room shifted. Eyes moved to Clara. She felt them, the skepticism, the curiosity, the instinctive social calculation of men deciding how much weight to give a woman standing in a room she wasn't expected to be part of. She had spent 3 years being weighed by rooms like this one. She was very good at not flinching under the weight. She stepped forward. "Your Honor," she said, "my name is Clara Whitcomb. I was hired to restore the family portrait currently hanging in the East Gallery. In the course of that restoration, I uncovered an original figure that had been painted over a child identified in household records as James Alderton. I also examined estate records and correspondence dating to the relevant period." She placed her own documents on the table, Granger's 3 letters, the ledger pages, the correspondence she and Nathaniel had found the previous night. What Mr. Harrow has presented is accurate as far as it goes. James Alderton's inheritance rights were real. The 1791 transfer was obtained fraudulently. Eliza Blackwood was deceived. Harrow's expression didn't change, but something tightened around his eyes. What Mr. Harrow has not told you, Clara continued, her voice steady and clear, is that a Philadelphia solicitor named Hugh Granger identified this fraud in 1791 and was preparing a legal challenge. He wrote to Eliza Blackwood to warn her. He told her not to sign anything further. She laid the 3rd Granger letter flat on the table, turned toward Judge Harrington. There was no 4th letter. Mr. Granger did not complete his challenge, and the land 800 acres of Alderton inheritance was quietly transferred through a series of transactions over the following 18 years. She paused. Transactions handled by Silas Harrow's bank. The room was very quiet. Harrington picked up the Granger letter. He read it slowly. Furthermore, Clara said, I have here payment records from the Blackwood estate accounts. Small repeated payments beginning in 1809. The year Mr. Harrow visited this house, to accounts bearing only initials in the ledger. She placed the copied ledger pages on the table. The pattern of these payments is not consistent with legitimate financial transactions. It is consistent with blackmail. Mr. Harrow did not come to this family to expose a fraud. He came to this family to profit from his knowledge of one. The silence broke. Not loudly, not with shouting or chair scraping, but with the particular low sound of men in a room recalibrating. The sound of the narrative shifting under everyone's feet. Harrow said with perfect composure, These are serious accusations from a woman with a ruined family name and an obvious personal motive. Charles Whitcomb. Miss Whitcomb's father was himself implicated in fraudulent investment schemes. I would ask this assembly to consider the source. He said it pleasantly. He said it the way he said everything, smoothly, without evident malice, with the manner of a man simply raising a reasonable concern. And it landed. Clara could feel it land. Could see it in the slight adjustment of 2 men's postures, the reassessment, the doubt, the familiar social instinct to discount a ruined woman's word against a polished man's. She had expected this. She had prepared for this. My father, she said, without hesitation, without raising her voice, was implicated in schemes organized by investors, whose transactions were handled by Harrow's bank. I have correspondence here between my father's solicitor and a partner at Harrow's institution, dating to 1812, in which my father repeatedly requested documentation for investments he had been told were legitimate, and repeatedly received reassurances, but no documentation. She placed the letters on the table. My father did not understand what he was signing, Your Honor, because he was told by a man he trusted that it was a routine matter. She looked at Harrow. The same language used to describe what happened to Eliza Blackwood 20 years earlier. The room absorbed that. Harrow's composure held. It was extraordinary, Clara thought, the quality of his composure. The way it didn't crack even when what was happening was clearly not what he had planned. This is a great deal of paper, he said, assembled by a woman with every reason to see what she wants to see. Then let the paper speak, Judge Harrington said quietly. He had been reading. He had been reading for the past 3 minutes without looking up, moving from document to document with the methodical attention of a man who took his office seriously. Mr. Harrow, these account notations. He held up the ledger pages. Can you identify the recipients? A pause, barely a beat, but Clara caught it. Those records are incomplete, Harrow said, without the corresponding bank documentation. I have the corresponding bank documentation, said a voice from the doorway. Every head in the room turned. Mrs. Reed stood in the doorway. She was holding a bundle of papers, yellowed, tied with cord, and she was holding them the way a person held something they had been keeping safe for a very long time and were finally willing to set down. I beg your pardon, she said to Judge Harrington, without apology in her voice, without deference, with the simple authority of a woman who had waited 40 years for this moment and was not going to let its arrival make her small. My name is Abigail Reed. I have been housekeeper of Blackwood Hall for 22 years. Before that, I was a housemaid here for 19 years. I knew James Alderton. I watched him be removed from this house. And I have kept these papers since 1809, when I found them in a box of materials that a man working for Silas Harrow left behind in the estate office. She crossed the room and placed the bundle on the table in front of Judge Harrington. I didn't know what they were at the time. I know now. Harrington untied this cord and looked at the first page. His expression did not change, but something happened behind his eyes, a settling, a solidifying the look of a man whose existing picture of a situation had just snapped into sharp and irreversible focus. "Mr. Harrow," he said, still looking at the page, "these appear to be transfer documents bearing your institution's seal. For land transactions in Western Virginia, dated 1797 through 1808. He looked up. "Are you familiar with these documents?" Harrow said nothing. And in that silence, in the first silence, Clara had heard from him that wasn't calculated and purposeful. She felt the balance of the room tip. Felt it the way you felt a scale move when the last weight was placed on it. Felt the tipping point arrive. "I believe," Harrington said with the careful precision of a man choosing words that would matter for a long time, "that we need to suspend these proceedings, pending a thorough legal examination of the documents before us." He looked at Harrow. "Mr. Harrow, I am asking you to remain in Virginia and make yourself available for further questioning. I am also asking your institution to submit to examination of its transaction records from 1795 through the present." A pause. "I trust that will not be a problem." "Of course not," Harrow said. Smooth, still performing ease. "I welcome any examination. I have nothing to hide." He looked across the table at Clara as he said it. Clara held his gaze. She had expected to feel triumph. She didn't. What she felt was something quieter and more complicated, the particular feeling of a truth finally given enough air to breathe after a very long time underground. The assembly broke apart. Men moved, spoke, gathered in small groups with the low, urgent murmur of people recalibrating everything they thought they knew about the most powerful banker in their acquaintance. The newspaper correspondent from Washington City was writing in his notebook, with an energy that suggested tomorrow's edition was already writing itself. Nathaniel appeared beside her. He didn't say anything immediately. He just stood there for a moment, close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him, the steadiness of him, and looked at the table where the documents were still spread out, the whole assembled weight of 30 years of buried truth now lying in plain sight in the morning light. Then he said very quietly, "You did that." "We did that," Clara said. "Mrs. Reed did that. Your mother did that by keeping those letters." She paused. "James did that by existing." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "Harrington will order a full investigation," he said. "It'll take months. Harrow's lawyers will fight it." "Yes," Clara said. "They will. And until it's settled, Harrow is dangerous," Clara said. "He has enough resources and enough connections to do damage, even from a weakened position. We need to be careful." She looked at him. "You need to be careful." Something changed in his expression. Not the authority that was still there would always be there was built into the bones of him, but underneath it something more personal, something that was looking at her directly, without the careful social distance that men of his position maintained with women in hers. "Clara," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. Not Miss Whitcomb, not Miss Mercer, Clara. She felt it land somewhere in her chest and tried to be sensible about what it meant. "Nathaniel," she said. "When this is over," he stopped, reconsidered. "When this is settled, I want to talk to you about something that has nothing to do with Harrow or the portrait or the investigation." "All right," she said carefully, "but not now." "No," she agreed, "not now." He nodded once and moved away to speak with Judge Harrington, who was waiting for him with the expression of a man who had questions that needed answering before he could leave. Clara turned toward the door. She was 2 steps from it when Harrow fell into step beside her. He didn't touch her. He didn't raise his voice. He walked at exactly her pace, close enough to speak quietly. And what he said was delivered with the same pleasantness he used for everything. The pleasantness that was starting to feel to Clara like a hand held open, right before it closed. "Impressive performance," he said. "Your father would have been proud." "Yes," Clara said. "He would. Of course a performance is only as good as its aftermath." He kept walking. "Documents can be challenged. Witnesses can be discredited. Old housekeepers can be shown to have personal motives. The law is a slow machine. Miss Whitcomb and I have been operating it for a very long time." A pause. "You've had your morning. Enjoy it." He walked past her out the door. Clara stood in the corridor and felt the cold certainty of what he'd just told her settle into her stomach. This wasn't over. She had known it wouldn't be over, had told herself it wouldn't be over. But hearing him say it with that particular quality of assurance that came from a man who had survived every previous version of this made the knowing more real. He was going to come after them. Not in a parlor in front of witnesses. Somewhere quieter. Somewhere with less oversight. Somewhere that a man with money and connections and 30 years of practice at making problems disappear could work without an audience. She went to find Nathaniel. He was with Harrington, and she didn't interrupt, but she caught his eye across the room, and something in her expression told him enough that he wrapped the conversation up quickly and came to her. "He just warned me," she said quietly. "In the corridor." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "What did he say?" "That documents can be challenged and witnesses discredited, and that he's been operating the law longer than I have." She looked at him steadily. "He's not going to wait for a formal investigation to move against us. Whatever he plans to do, he'll do it before Harrington's people arrive to examine the records." "How long do we have?" "I don't know. Days. Maybe less." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. In his eyes, she could see the calculation, the rapid practical assessment of a former militia officer deciding what the terrain required. And then, underneath the calculation, something else. Something that had been building, she realized, since the night she had turned to face him in the gallery and refused to step back. "Then we don't wait either," he said. "No." Clara agreed. "We don't." What happened next came faster than either of them had planned for. It was barely past noon when one of Nathaniel's stable hands came to the house with word that a rider had been seen on the eastern road, a rider who had turned off before the main gate and taken the river path. It was the kind of information that meant nothing on its own, and everything in context, and Nathaniel understood the context immediately. "He's not going to wait until tonight," Nathaniel said. "He's sending someone," Clara said, "for the documents." They moved fast. Clara gathered the correspondence bundle and the ledger pages from the parlor table. Nathaniel went for his coat. Mrs. Reed was already in the entrance hall when they came through it, holding her own copy of the Granger letters. She had made copies the night before without being asked, because 40 years of keeping secrets had taught her that one set of documents was never enough. "Where?" Mrs. Reed asked. "Harrington," Nathaniel said. "His house is 2 miles east. If we can get these to him directly." The window at the end of the hall shattered. Not from outside. From a stone thrown hard that skittered across the floor and came to rest against the opposite wall, followed immediately by the sound of horses, 2, maybe 3, coming up the side of the estate at speed. Mrs. Reed did not flinch. Clara did not flinch. Nathaniel said very calmly, "Back door, now." They ran. The river road at the back of the estate was the fastest route to Harrington's property. If you knew it, and Nathaniel knew it, the way a man knew ground, he had walked since childhood. Clara stayed close behind him, the document bundle pressed against her chest, running in a way she hadn't run since the winter she'd had to leave the Boston house in the dark with nothing but what she could carry. Her lungs burned. The summer heat was brutal, the air thick with river humidity. She could hear shouting from the direction of the house. Harrow's men, she thought, discovering the empty parlor, discovering the missing documents, and she ran harder. Nathaniel pulled up short and grabbed her arm. 3 men blocked the river path ahead. Clara recognized the one in the center. She had seen him speaking with Harrow that morning shortly before the proceeding, began a large man with a manner that suggested he was not present at the gathering for the conversation or the whiskey. "Mr. Blackwood," the man said. "Mr. Harrow would like his documents returned." "They aren't his documents," Nathaniel said. "He believes differently." "Then he and I have a disagreement." The man took a step forward. The two flanking him moved with him, the practiced, simultaneous movement of men who had done this before. Clara did not wait to see what came next. She reached into the bag at her hip, pulled out the small bottle of cleaning solvent she had carried since leaving the gallery. Turpentine oil of spikes strong enough to take paint off canvas, strong enough to take the steadiness out of a man who got it in his eyes and threw it. Not at the man in the center. At the lantern hanging from the post at the edge of the path. The glass broke. The solvent caught. The flame that erupted was not large, but it was sudden, and it was bright, and it was exactly loud enough and hot enough to make three men who had been moving forward stop moving forward for the 2 seconds that Nathaniel needed. He moved like a man who had spent 3 years in a Virginia militia learning what those 2 seconds were worth. The first man went down hard. The second stumbled back. The third turned to run and collided with his own horse, which had shied from the fire, and went down in a tangle of reins and confusion. Nathaniel grabbed Clara's hand. They ran. She didn't look back. She didn't stumble. She kept pace with him, stride for stride, down the river path through the summer heat, with the document bundle in her arms and her heart hammering, and the absolute crystalline clarity of a woman who has just understood that she is not going to let 30 years of buried truth stay buried one day longer. They reached Harrington's gate as the sun was crossing its highest point. Nathaniel pounded on the door. It opened, and Clara Whitcomb, breathing hard, solvent-stained her hair coming down from its pins holding the evidence that could bring down Silas Harrow and clear her father's name, walked through it. Judge Harrington took one look at them. "Sit down," he said, "both of you, and start from the beginning." Harrington listened without interrupting. That was the first thing Clara noticed the quality of his attention. Not the performative listening of men who waited for their turn to speak, but the real kind, the kind that took everything in and sorted it while it arrived. He sat across from them at his study table with the documents spread before him, and he read while she talked, and when she finished, he asked 3 precise questions, waited for 3 precise answers, and then sat back and said nothing for almost a full minute. Clara let him have the silence. She had learned from years of working with men who held power in their hands that the silence before a decision was sacred. Interrupting it only made men defensive. Nathaniel sat beside her. His breathing controlled his hands still. The cut on his left forearm from the river path struggle had bled through his sleeve, and he hadn't mentioned it once. Finally, Harrington said, "How many copies of these documents exist?" 3 sets, Clara said. "Mrs. Reed holds 1. I have 1. You now have 1. Where is Mrs. Reed?" "She went north from the estate when we went east. She has instructions to reach your colleague Judge Alderman in Richmond if she doesn't hear from us by nightfall." Harrington looked at her with an expression that was not quite surprise, but was something adjacent to it. The look of a man recalibrating his estimate of the person sitting across from him. "You planned this before the proceeding this morning," he said. "I planned for the possibility that the proceeding wouldn't end cleanly," Clara said. "It didn't." Harrington looked at Nathaniel. "She's thorough." "I'm aware," Nathaniel said. "The men on the river path." "Harrow's," Nathaniel said. "I recognized at least one of them from Washington City. He brought them with him to the gathering. He came prepared to take these documents by force if the proceeding didn't go his way," Harrington said. It wasn't a question. He was simply saying it out loud the way judges said things out loud when they were building a record in their own minds. "Yes," Clara said. Harrington picked up the ledger pages again. He studied the payment notations, the years of small patient extractions from a family that hadn't known it was being bled. Then he set them down and looked at the Granger letters. Then the transfer documents that Mrs. Reed had kept for 17 years, in what Clara could only assume was the courage of a woman who had known she might need them someday and had simply refused to let go. "I'm going to send for the federal marshal," Harrington said. "Today, Harrow will not leave Virginia while this investigation is pending." He paused. "I want you both to stay here tonight. It's safer." "I need to go back to Blackwood Hall," Nathaniel said. "Nathaniel," Clara started. "The guests are still there. My household is still there. I am not going to sit in Harrington's study while Harrow's men go through my estate." His voice was even, but underneath it was something immovable, the particular stubbornness of a man who knew exactly where his line was and had just reached it. "I appreciate the offer, Harrington, genuinely, but Blackwood Hall is my responsibility." Harrington looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "Take 2 of my men with you." "I'll take them." "And Miss Whitcomb stays here." The words dropped into the room like a stone into still water, and the ripples from them reached Clara immediately in the exact place they were aimed. She said very calmly, "No." Both men looked at her. "I understand the intention," she said, "and I appreciate it. But the evidence connecting Harrow to my father's ruin is still at Blackwood Hall in the correspondence files we were working from last night. If Harrow's men reach those files before we do, that part of the case disappears." She met Harrington's gaze steadily. "I know where every document is. Nathaniel doesn't. I go back with him." Harrington studied her face. Then he looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel said nothing. But the look he gave Clara was brief and direct, and carried underneath its practicality something that was not entirely practical. "Take 4 of my men," Harrington said. They left within the hour. The ride back to Blackwood Hall was fast and mostly silent. Clara rode beside Nathaniel with Harrington's 4 men flanking them, and the summer afternoon pressed down on all of them with the particular weight of heat that had been building since morning. She was aware in the specific way you became aware of things when the immediate crisis had passed and the next one hadn't arrived yet, of how tired she was. Of how long it had been since she had slept. Of how much of herself she had spent in the last 24 hours. She was also aware of Nathaniel riding beside her, the set of his shoulders, the way he held the reins. The fact that he had not let go of her hand on the river path until they reached Harrington's gate, and had only released it then because the door was opening and there were other people to perform composure for. He hadn't mentioned it. Neither had she. Blackwood Hall, when they reached it, was in a particular kind of disorder, not the disorder of violence, but of aftermath. Guests who had been preparing to leave were still there, suspended in the uncomfortable position of people who had witnessed something significant and hadn't yet been told what to do about it. Servants moved through the house with the quick, careful movements of people managing anxiety through action. 2 of Harrow's horses were still in the stable yard, which told Clara that at least some of his men were still on the property. But Harrow himself was gone. Nathaniel's stable hand confirmed it the moment they dismounted. Harrow had left through the main gate 20 minutes after the proceeding broke up, taking his personal carriage and 2 riders. "He's running," one of Harrington's men said. "He's not running," Clara said. "He's regrouping." She was already moving toward the house. "He knows the federal marshal will be looking for him. He'll go to Washington City, where he has connections, where he can work the political channels, where he can spend the next 6 months making this investigation complicated." She pushed through the entrance door. "Which means we have 6 months to make sure complicated isn't enough." The correspondence files were where she'd left them in the estate office, undisturbed. Either Harrow's men hadn't known to look there, or they hadn't had time. Clara went through the room methodically, checking every drawer, every cabinet, every surface, and found nothing missing. She was checking the 3rd cabinet when Nathaniel appeared in the doorway. "It's all here," she said without turning around. "Good." He came into the room. She heard him lean against the wall behind her, heard the quiet exhale of a man letting himself be tired for the first time all day. "Harrington's men will stay through tonight. The marshal should arrive by tomorrow morning." "And the guests?" "Leaving. Most of them have already called for their carriages." A pause. "The correspondent from Washington City left 2 hours ago. Whatever he files for tomorrow's paper is already written." Clara closed the cabinet. She turned around. Nathaniel was watching her with the direct, unguarded attention he'd been using more often in the past 48 hours, less of the performance of authority, more of the man underneath it. "He'll use the newspapers," she said. "Harrow will. Whatever the marshal does, whatever Harrington's investigation finds, Harrow will fight it in print before he fights it in court. He'll make this about a ruined woman with a personal grudge and a Virginia landowner who was fool enough to believe her." "Let him," Nathaniel said. Clara looked at him. "I said, let him," Nathaniel repeated, and his voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before, something past stubbornness, something that came from a deeper and more settled place. "The truth is, in those documents, Harrington has them. The marshal will have them. Whatever Harrow puts in the newspapers, the documents exist." He paused. "And so do you." "My name is not an asset in this," Clara said carefully. "My father's reputation, my history, the name I was working under, none of that helps the case. Your name is exactly what this case needs." He straightened from the wall, crossed the room toward her, not quickly, not dramatically, but with the deliberate, unhurried movement of a man who had decided something and was carrying that decision in his whole body. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she had to look up to meet his eyes. "Clara, you found the boy in the painting. You found Granger's letters. You were the one who understood what the ledgers meant. You were the one who threw a bottle of turpentine at a lantern on a river path and bought us the time we needed." A pause. "Harrow wants your name to be a liability. I'm telling you it's not." Clara held his gaze. She wanted to argue, had the argument already assembled the reasonable practical case for why her presence in this made things harder for him, not easier. Why a man of his standing, married to a scandal, was a man with a target on him that never came off. But standing this close to him, with everything that had happened in the past 24 hours still alive in her chest, the argument felt less true than it usually did. "You barely know me," she said. "I know you didn't step back," he said. "Not once. Not in the gallery. Not in the parlor this morning. Not on the river path. You didn't step back, and you didn't stop, and you didn't ask anyone to carry what was yours to carry." Something moved through his expression, something honest and undefended. "I have been surrounded my whole life by people who stepped back, who went quiet when the room got hard. I did not know until this week how much I had been waiting for someone who wouldn't." Clara said nothing. The thing in her chest was doing something complicated that she was trying very hard to be sensible about. "I'm not asking you anything right now," Nathaniel said. "I know the timing is wrong. I know there's an investigation pending and the marshal arriving tomorrow and a newspaper correspondent somewhere between here and Washington City writing things about both of us that will make next week unpleasant." He paused. "I'm just telling you. So you know, whatever comes next, I'm not asking you to go." Clara looked at him for a long moment. At this man who had grown up alone in a house built on a lie he hadn't known, was a lie who had paced a floor above the gallery at 4 a.m, who had stood in a room full of judges and political men and said her name and asked them to listen to her without qualification or condition. "All right," she said. It was not much. She knew it was not much. But he received it the way she intended it, as the first word of something rather than the last, as a door opening rather than closing. He nodded once, stepped back, became the composed Virginia landowner, again the practical man with a household to manage and a federal marshal to prepare for. "Get some sleep," he said. "I mean it. You've been awake for 2 days. So have you. I have a higher tolerance for suffering," he said. And there was the first real edge of humor she had heard from him. Dry, understated, delivered without any performance around it, and it landed somewhere in her that she hadn't expected humor to land. She slept. She woke to Mrs. Reed sitting in the chair beside the bed in the room she'd been given on the hall's upper floor, holding a cup of something hot, her expression carrying the particular combination of relief and lingering anxiety that belonged to people who had done something irreversible and were still deciding whether it was the right thing. "You came back," Clara said. "Clara." "Of course I came back," Mrs. Reed said. "This is my house." She set the cup on the bedside table. "Judge Alderman is sending a letter to the federal court in Washington. He's also sending a deposition affirming the authenticity of the documents I brought him." A pause. He knew Hugh Granger, it turns out. They studied law together in Philadelphia. He said Granger was one of the most honest men he ever knew, and that it was not at all surprising that Granger had been stopped from completing his challenge, and that whoever stopped him would have needed significant resources and connections to do it. Clara sat up. "Harrow had those in 1791. "His father did," Mrs. Reed said. "Harrow inherited the institution from his father, and apparently inherited the methods along with it." She paused. "Alderman said this isn't the first time Harrow's bank has been named in connection with fraudulent transfers. There were complaints in 1804 and again in 1809. Nothing was ever formally pursued. Because Harrow had the connections to stop it. Yes, but Alderman says this time is different. The volume of documentation, the pattern of payments, the Granger letters." She looked at Clara steadily. "He says this time it will hold." Clara picked up the cup. The tea was strong and very hot, and she held it with both hands and felt for the first time in what might have been years something that was not quite peace, but was in the same neighborhood as it. The newspaper arrived 3 days later. It was worse than Clara had expected, which was saying something because she had expected it to be bad. The Washington City correspondent had written 2 pieces, one ostensibly factual account of the proceeding at Blackwood Hall, and one editorial that did not have her name in it, but described with unmistakable specificity a woman of ruined family and questionable credential who had inserted herself into a Virginia estate matter for personal and financial motives. Nathaniel read both pieces at the breakfast table. His face gave nothing away. When he finished, he set the paper down and asked for more coffee with the equanimity of a man who had decided not to let a newspaper make decisions for him. It was Mrs. Reed who said what needed to be said. "People will talk," she said bluntly. "They already are. 2 of the guests from the gathering have already written letters, I'm told, questioning Miss Whitcomb's role and motives." "Let them write," Nathaniel said. "It'll affect your standing, your political relationships, men you need." "Mrs. Reed." His voice was quiet and even and completely certain. "I spent 34 years building standing on ground I didn't know was compromised. Whatever I rebuild from here, I build it honest." He picked up his coffee. "That's not negotiable." Mrs. Reed looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Clara. The look said clearly and without words, "This is what Eliza Blackwood would have wanted her son to be." Clara said nothing. She looked at the newspaper and thought about the correspondent from Washington City, and about the particular violence of ink, how it could take a life and reduce it to a line, how it could take a woman's courage and call it scheming, how it could take 3 years of surviving alone and call it motive. Then she thought about Hugh Granger's 3rd letter sitting in Harrington's safe, about Mrs. Reed keeping documents for 17 years in the faith that they would matter someday, about her father who had believed in the dignity of honest work right up until the moment that belief cost him everything. She picked up her pen. She had brought it from her satchel that morning without entirely deciding why. Now she knew. She began to write. Not a legal document, not a deposition. A letter addressed to the editor of the Washington City paper, signed with her full name, Clara Whitcomb, formerly of Boston, currently of Richmond, presently of Blackwood Hall, Virginia, in the summer of 1816. A letter that said in plain American English exactly what had happened, and what she had found, and what it meant, and who her father was, and what had been done to him. A letter that did not ask for sympathy or understanding. That simply laid the truth on the table, the way she laid evidence on a table, cleanly, completely, without decoration or apology. She wrote for 2 hours. When she finished, she read it back. Then she handed it to Nathaniel. He read it without speaking. When he finished, he set it down. "If you send this," he said, "there's no taking it back." "I know." "Your name will be in every paper from here to Boston." "My name is already in every paper from here to Boston," Clara said. "The question is whether it's in there as Harrow wrote it or as I write it." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "The mail rider goes through tomorrow morning." "I know," Clara said. She sealed the letter that evening. She was standing at the window of the gallery, the restored portrait behind her, James looking out from the canvas in the warm late afternoon light, when she heard Nathaniel's boots on the floor. He stood beside her. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Outside, somewhere on the grounds, one of Harrington's men was still posted at the gate. The world beyond the estate continued its ordinary business, horses on the road, the distant sound of the river, the birds that made their noise regardless of what human beings were doing beneath them. "The marshal arrives tomorrow," Nathaniel said. "I know." Harrington sent word. "Harrow is in Washington City. He's already met with 2 senators. "Of course he has." "Harrington says it doesn't matter. The documentation is too complete." Clara nodded. "Clara." He said her name the way he'd been saying it for 3 days now, not carefully, not with the social precision of a man managing appropriate distance, but simply, directly. Like a man who had decided that her name meant what it meant, and he was going to use it without apology. She turned to look at him. "I want you to know something," he said. "Whatever the marshal finds, whatever the newspapers say, whatever it takes to get through the next 6 months of this." He held her gaze with the same unwavering directness he'd been directing at her since the night in the gallery when she had turned and not stepped back. "I meant what I said in the estate office. I'm not asking you to go." Clara looked at him. At this man who had inherited a lie and chosen when the lie was shown to him not to defend it, but to dismantle it. Who had stood in a parlor full of powerful men and said her name without qualification. Who had held her hand on a river path and not mentioned it afterward because some things didn't need to be mentioned to be real. "I know you're not," she said, "and I want—" He stopped. She could see him choosing words with the care of a man who didn't waste them. "I want to ask you something. Not today. Not while there's a marshal arriving and an investigation pending and your letter still sealed on the table. But soon." "All right," Clara said. "You'll know what it is." "I expect I will," she said. They stood together at the window while the summer afternoon moved toward evening, and the painting behind them held its restored truth in the warm light, and the sealed letter sat on the table, waiting for morning. And the world outside the estate continued its ordinary noise, entirely unaware that something had shifted inside Blackwood Hall that was never going to shift back. It was Mrs. Reed who found Clara an hour later still standing at the window and handed her a cup of tea without comment. "He's a good man," Mrs. Reed said after a moment. "I know," Clara said. "His mother would have liked you." Clara looked at the portrait. At Eliza Blackwood sitting slightly forward in her chair, one hand on the armrest with the expression of a woman who had something to say and had long since decided the room wasn't worth saying it to. "I think," Clara said quietly, "she would have understood me." Mrs. Reed followed her gaze to the portrait, to Eliza, to James standing beside his mother with his silver rattle and his recovered face and his 40 years of enforced silence finally broken. "Yes," Mrs. Reed said, "I believe she would have." Outside, the summer evening came on slow and warm, the way Virginia evenings did, without hurry, without apology. And inside Blackwood Hall, for the first time in a very long time, the silence felt less like something being hidden and more like something simply resting, gathering itself for what came next. The letter reached Washington City in 4 days. The response came back in 7. Clara was in the gallery when Mrs. Reed brought her the paper. Not the original Washington City correspondence publication, but a different one, smaller, more serious, the kind of paper that lawyers and federal men read over breakfast before they read anything else. The editor had printed her letter in full. Beside it, he had printed a brief editorial note stating that the claims within had been reviewed by 2 members of his staff with legal training, that the documentation referenced was being examined by federal authorities, and that the public deserved to know that the investigation into Silas Harrow's financial institution had been formally opened by order of a federal judge. Clara read it twice. Then she set it down on the work table and sat very still for a moment. She had not let herself hope until this morning. Hope, in her experience, was a thing you rationed carefully, the way you rationed expensive pigment, too much too fast, and you ran out before the work was finished. But sitting in the gallery with James, watching from the restored canvas, and the morning light coming through the windows, and this paper in her hands, she let a small, careful amount of hope in. Her father's name was in the letter she had written. She had put it there deliberately, precisely, in the third paragraph. Charles Whitcomb of Boston, a man of honest character and careful habit, who was deceived by instruments he was told were legitimate, whose reputation was destroyed by the same institutional fraud now under federal examination. She had not asked for sympathy. She had simply stated the fact. Her father existed. He had been wronged. He deserved to be named. Seeing it in print, his name in a serious paper, in a sentence that did not call him a fraudster or a failure, was the thing she had not been prepared for. She pressed her hand flat against the page and breathed. Nathaniel found her like that. He didn't say anything immediately. He came and stood beside her and looked at the paper and let the silence be what it needed to be, which was one of the things about him she had come to understand in the past 2 weeks, that he knew the difference between a silence that needed filling and one that needed keeping. "Alderman sent word this morning," he said finally. "Harrow's institution is frozen pending the investigation. His accounts in Washington City and Philadelphia both." A pause. "His lawyers filed a challenge yesterday. Harrington says it won't hold." "It won't?" Clara said. "The Granger letters alone are enough to make the 1791 transfer unenforceable. The ledger payments corroborate the blackmail, and the transfer documents Mrs. Reed kept." She stopped, shook her head slightly. "He built this on the assumption that no one would ever assemble all of it in one place. He was right for 30 years. "He was wrong about you," Nathaniel said. Clara looked up at him. He was watching her with that direct, unguarded attention that she had stopped trying to interpret and simply accepted as the way he looked at her fully, without the performance of social distance, as though she were a fact he had decided to stop qualifying. "There's something else," he said. She waited. "Harrington received a communication this morning from a family in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania." His voice was careful, not tense, but deliberate, the way his voice got when he was carrying something that required delicacy. "A family named Whitfield. They read about the investigation in the Pennsylvania papers." He paused. "They have a man living with them, 61 years old. His name is James." The gallery went very quiet. Clara set the paper down. "He's alive," she said. "Apparently, he has been this whole time. The Whitfield family took him in as a child, a boy of 4, brought to them by a man from Virginia in the spring of 1785. They were told his parents had died. They raised him as their own." Nathaniel's voice was steady, but she could hear what was underneath the steadiness, the enormous, complicated weight of a man learning that the brother painted out of his family's history had been living an ordinary life in Pennsylvania for 31 years. "He's a carpenter now. He has a wife and 3 children. Clara looked at him, at this man who had grown up alone in a house that should have held a brother. She watched him absorb the news, the way she had watched him absorb every other revelation in the past weeks. Not by collapsing under it, but by standing still and letting it find its place inside him. Reorganizing around it, becoming someone who knew this now, and was deciding what to do with the knowing. "Are you all right?" she asked. He looked at the painting. At James, the small recovered face, the silver rattle, the Alderton crest, that had waited 30 years to matter. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. "I think I will be." A pause. "I think I need to go to Pennsylvania." "Yes," Clara said. "You do." He looked at her. "Will you come?" She had not expected the question. Or perhaps she had expected it and had not let herself expect it, which was different. She looked at him at the particular quality of the question, the way it was not a request for assistance or an acknowledgement of her professional usefulness, but simply an honest statement of wanting her to be there, and felt something settle inside her that had been unsettled for a very long time. "Yes," she said. They left for Pennsylvania 4 days later, after the federal marshal had formally taken custody of Harrow's primary documents, and Harrington had confirmed that Harrow himself was in federal custody pending trial. The arrest had happened quietly, no drama, no public scene. Just two federal men arriving at the Washington City Hotel, where Harrow had been working his political connections, and informing him that his presence was required elsewhere. Clara had not been there for it. She had heard about it from Harrington's writer, and she had sat with the information for a moment, and then she had gone back to what she was doing, which was packing her restoration tools into their oilcloth wrapping for the journey north. She did not feel triumph. She had expected to feel triumph. What she felt instead was something quieter and more complete. The feeling of a door closing on a room that had needed closing for a long time, and the air on the other side of it being different. Cleaner. More itself. The meeting with James happened on a Wednesday morning. They had sent word ahead through Harrington's office so he would not be surprised. Even so, when they arrived at the Whitfield house in Lancaster County, and the door opened, and a man of 61 stood in the frame, tall with his mother's eyes, and the patient stillness of a person who had made a life with his hands, and found it sufficient, the reality of him was different from everything Clara had imagined it would be. Nathaniel stopped on the path. James looked at him. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then James said in a voice that was quiet and measured, and carried 31 years of a different kind of life in it, "You have your mother's face." And Nathaniel, who had stood without flinching in a parlor full of judges, and ridden a river path toward armed men, and carried himself through the hardest 2 weeks of his life, with the composure of a man who did not permit himself to break in front of others. Nathaniel breathed out something that was not quite a sound, and not quite silence, and pressed his hand briefly to his eyes. Clara stayed where she was. This was not hers. This was theirs. These two men on a Pennsylvania path meeting for the first time across the distance of everything that had been done to them. She simply bore witness, which was sometimes the most important thing a person could do. They went inside. They talked for 3 hours. Clara sat at the edge of it, occasionally answering questions that James directed toward her about the evidence and the investigation, but mostly listening as two half-brothers who had never known each other assembled the shape of what their shared history actually was, not the version Silas Harrow had been monetizing, not the version the old Mr. Blackwood had painted over, but the real one, which was messier and sadder and more human than any of the other versions. James did not want the Alderton land. He said so plainly without apparent resentment or performance, in the tone of a man who had already made his peace with something before anyone arrived to discuss it. "I have a life," he said, "a good one. I have a wife and children who know who I am. I don't want an estate in Virginia." He looked at Nathaniel. "What I want is to know my brother, if that's something you want too." Nathaniel said, "It is." James nodded once. The nod was small and simple and carried everything. The legal resolution of the Alderton land rights came 6 weeks later. James signed a formal statement confirming his legitimate birth and inheritance rights, which the federal court used to establish the fraud of the 1791 transfer, which in turn became the central instrument in the case against Harrow. James then signed a second statement, choosing not to exercise those inheritance rights, as was his legal prerogative. The Alderton land remained under Blackwood title, its history now documented and acknowledged rather than buried. Silas Harrow's trial took 4 months. Clara testified. She stood in the federal courtroom in Washington City and gave her account clearly and completely. The restoration, the discovery, the evidence, the ledgers, the letters, the river path, all of it. And she did it without apology, and without softening, and without once looking at Harrow, who sat at the defendant's table, with the performance of composure that she now recognized as the only thing he had ever genuinely owned. She looked at the judge instead. She spoke to the record. She spoke for Hugh Granger, who had tried to stop this in 1791 and been stopped himself. She spoke for Eliza Blackwood, who had signed papers she didn't understand and spent the rest of her life knowing something had been taken that she couldn't get back. She spoke for her father, who had died carrying a weight that wasn't his. She spoke clearly, and she did not shake. The verdict came on a Thursday morning in November, when Virginia had finally released its summer heat, and the air was beginning to remember, It knew how to be cold. Silas Harrow was convicted of fraud, forgery, extortion, and conspiracy. His institution was dissolved. His assets were seized for distribution to identifiable victims of his schemes, a list that the federal court was still compiling, but that included by documentation Clara had submitted the Whitcomb estate losses of 1813. The money would not bring her father back. She had known that. She had never expected it to. But when the rider arrived at Blackwood Hall with the verdict, and she read the word convicted, and beneath it, her father's name on the victim's list, and beside his name, the notation pending restitution, she went to the gallery. She stood in front of the portrait. In front of James, fully visible, fully restored, standing beside his mother, with the silver rattle and the Alderton crest and 30 years of stolen existence, finally acknowledged by the record of the world. She said out loud to no one, and to her father both, "It's done." And then, because she had been waiting for 3 years, and the waiting was over, she let herself cry. Not for long. Not with the self-indulgence of someone who had forgotten there was work still to do. But for the length of time that was owed to a man who had deserved better and gotten it too late, she let herself cry. Nathaniel found her when she was finished. He didn't ask what she was feeling. He already knew. He simply stood beside her and looked at the portrait with her, and let the moment be what it was. "It's done," she said again, out loud, to him this time. "It's done," he confirmed. She dried her eyes. She straightened. She turned away from the portrait and looked at him, at this man who had walked through the past 4 months of investigation and testimony, and public scrutiny, and newspaper speculation, with the same unwavering steadiness he'd walked toward her in the gallery that first night, and who had asked her at the end of every single one of those days whether she was all right, and actually listened to the answer. "You said you wanted to ask me something," she said. "In the estate office, the day after the proceeding. You said not today. I remember. It's not that day anymore." He looked at her for a moment. The direct, unguarded look. The one that didn't perform anything. Then he said, "Clara Whitcomb, I would like you to marry me." He said it simply. No preamble. No elaborate declaration. Just the plain statement of a man who had spent 4 months deciding whether he wanted to say this, and had decided yes, and was now saying it. Clara looked at him. She thought about the gallery the first night, and the corridor at 4 in the morning, and the river path and Harrington's study, and the letter she had written at the breakfast table, and the morning the verdict came. She thought about every moment in the past 4 months when she could have chosen to step back and hadn't, and she thought about every moment he had not asked her to. She thought about her father, about what he would say if he could see her here in this house, with this evidence, with this man with her name in the federal record, not as a ruined woman, but as the person who had found the truth. He would say, "Clara, you built that." "Yes," she said. Not quietly, not with hesitation, with the full, certain voice of a woman who had earned the right to her own answer and knew it. He reached out and took her hand. His grip was the same as it had been on the river path, steady, real, without performance. She held it back with the same steadiness, and they stood together in the gallery, where it had all begun, in front of the portrait that had started as a restoration and become something closer to a resurrection. The wedding was small. January 1817, in the front parlor of Blackwood Hall, with Harrington and his wife Mrs. Reed and James Whitfield and his family making the journey from Pennsylvania. No newspaper correspondent. No political guests. No performance of social standing. Just the people who had been there for what actually happened. Mrs. Reed cried, which she denied doing afterward, with a conviction that convinced no one. James stood with Nathaniel, which was not a thing that had been planned in advance, and which required no discussion when the moment arrived. He simply moved to stand beside his brother, and Nathaniel looked at him, and that was that. Clara wore the dress she had brought from Richmond in her single leather satchel. The good one, the one she'd packed on the theory that a woman should always have one good dress in her bag, because you never knew what the work was going to require. She had not admittedly anticipated it requiring this. Afterward in the parlor, while Mrs. Reed organized the meal, and James's children investigated every corner of Blackwood Hall with the thoroughness of small people encountering a very large new thing. Nathaniel stood beside Clara at the window, and she leaned against him without any particular self-consciousness about it. "What happens now?" she said. "I reckon we figure that out," he said. "I'm going to keep working," she said. "I want that understood." "I know. There are women in Richmond widowed abandoned working under false names because no one will hire them under their own. I want to open something for them. A workshop. A proper one with commissions and fair pay and their own names on the work." "I know," he said again. "You told me in September, and in October." "I wanted to make sure you'd heard it." "Clara." He turned to look at her. "I heard it the first time." She looked at him, at this man who had listened every single time without trying to reduce or redirect or manage what she was saying, who had stood in the full force of who she was and had not once asked her to be smaller. "All right," she said. In the spring she opened the workshop. It was a modest thing at first, 2 rooms on a respectable Richmond street. A sign that said, "Whitcomb Restoration and Document Work, Women's Collective established 1817. 3 women in the first month, 6 by summer, a waiting list by autumn." The first commission was a portrait restoration of Virginia family, whose painting had been damaged in a flood brought to Clara by a woman who had seen her name in the federal record and decided that a woman whose name was in that record was someone worth trusting with a valuable thing. Clara took the commission. She set the painting on the work table. She looked at the damage, the water staining the lifted paint, the obscured portions with the same focused attention she had brought to every piece of damaged work she'd ever encountered. Then she picked up her brush. Some people spent their lives running from what had been done to them. Clara Whitcomb had learned something better. She had learned that the truth once found did not need to hide. She had learned that the hands that were skilled enough to uncover a buried lie were also the hands skilled enough to restore what that lie had damaged. She had learned that a woman's name spoken clearly in her own voice was not a liability and not a scandal and not a thing to be managed. It was the most solid foundation there was. And she had built everything that mattered on it, starting with a painting in a locked gallery on a summer night in Virginia, and she was not finished building yet.